Hi, I'm Cathy Fleischer from Everyday Advocacy, and I'm very excited today to introduce you to Dr. Mike Sherry. Mike is Associate Professor of English Education at University of South Florida, studies teacher response to student writing and to student talk and whole class discussions. And he's also the co-director of the Tampa Bay Area Writing Project. I got connected to Mike through Tanya Baker, who's the director of the National Writing Project, who said, Mike has a really good story about advocacy to share. He told me about it last week. We thought this would be a great thing to share with others. So, welcome, Mike. Thanks for coming today.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
So, as you told me last week, you have this amazing story of your participation in a local school committee that was considering whether to ban 16 books that had been removed from school libraries because of alleged pornography. So I wondered if you could just tell us about your participation in that committee and what happened as a result of this committee.
Sure, I'd be glad to. Yeah. Um, Through my participation in the our local chapter of the National Writing Project, the Tampa Bay Area Writing Project, I met a teacher who was also a literacy coach in a local county, and she invited me to be on this committee where there had been a challenge from a local parent group to this set of books, and this poor teacher friend of mine had actually had to drive around to all the different libraries in that area and pull books off the shelves, which to me sounds like a soul killing experience. And she was very feeling that. And she said, "We're forming this committee, and there are going to be parents, there are going to be teachers, there are going to be guidance counselors, there are going to be NAACP representatives, there are going to be student representatives, and it's all going to be televised on local network at this community center in this conservative county in my state." And because I was kind of far away from that county, I ended up joining the committee virtually. So my giant head was on the Zoom screen during these meetings. And each week for 16 weeks, we discussed another one of the books that had been challenged. And our task was to decide whether this book was appropriate and, whether it should be kept out of libraries or returned to libraries. And so effectively during those 16 weeks, the books that had been challenged were censored, were removed from the library. And going into this, knowing that that was really, sort of the going to be the result, regardless of what we did, I felt so angry about this, and I really wanted to hate the people who had brought the challenge. And in fact, it wasn't even they who had brought the challenge; it was a national movement that had shared the texts of these challenges with multiple states. And so it had kind of come even from, it was completely decontextualized, and they were just kind of like implementing this in my state. But what I found was that, the people who had brought the challenge were like me, parents, concerned parents. And while I disagreed with their perspective and with the idea that wanting to keep something from their kids should mean keeping it from all kids, I nevertheless empathized with that. And it was really interesting for me to kind of hear those arguments and to think about what in particular I disagreed with. And, that there's a difference between putting a rating system on a movie and keeping all people from seeing that movie or something like that. And so the conversations on that committee were amazing, mostly because of the teachers who completely unpaid were showed up and said, all kinds of things about these books. One teacher in particular, I remember, always had a quote picked out that from each book that she absolutely was like, "This is the reason why this book cannot be. This is so important, this message." But I think the most memorable thing for me about these committees was the student participation. Each time there was a different student, and every time that student said, this book saved my life or the life of someone I know because they read this story and they knew that they were not alone and that this was an experience that could be survived, that could be shared. And so that was a really powerful message that came from the students, and I think very affecting for me and for the people in the room. And in particular, I remember this one young man, uh, 16-year-old, high school boy. When I think about how I was at that age, not as mature as this fellow, and he said, "This book that we're talking about is completely different from my experience. I don't identify with this. And that's what I appreciate so much about it. Because if I hadn't read this, I would never have known that this is happening. I'd never have known that this is what it's like to be in this kind of situation. It makes me so grateful for what I have, that I haven't experienced this kind of discrimination, this kind of violence. Um, and it makes me really glad to know about it because it's not okay, and we need to be able to do something about it, and somebody needs to be writing about it, and people that are experiencing it need to know that they're not alone and that this is being documented and shared.
I mean,
And I just went,
that's such an amazing story. I'm so glad you shared that. It's such an
yeah,
amazing story because it goes back to that windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors thing that those of us who are, in this world of books and book banning know, and diverse books know this. So thank you for sharing that. And then tell us what happened as a
yeah. So the amazing thing is that was really towards the end of the 16 weeks. And I went around and told that student story to everyone I could. And that week and every week, we voted all 16 books back into the libraries. And one of my favorite results of this is that there was a book in particular called It's Perfectly Normal, which is a book kind of about the changes that adolescents undergo and all of the amazing and curious things that happen. I wish I'd had this book in middle school, and there were only two copies in the libraries to start with that were pulled. But because the committee bought copies for everyone who participated, and then those copies had to be returned at the end, 24 copies of that book went back into libraries as a result of this. So it was sort of a nice byproduct of the whole experience.
I just love a story about book banning that has a happy ending.
I
Even
do
though it
too.
was 16 weeks that those
Yeah.
books were out of the classrooms or out of the libraries, then they
Yeah.
came back in. So it is a pretty happy ending given things that are going on.
True.
So what are your takeaways from it? And what if you're going to bring a message to teachers and librarians who might be listening to this right now, what would you say to them as the hope you found in this or the strategies or what can
Yeah.
people do that can maybe replicate what happened in your situation?
Sure. So I'm going to talk about three things. First of all, I think that participation of multiple allies was really important. And I went into it thinking I have a chance to use my voice and to speak up as a man, as a white man, as a professor in a kind of privileged position. That this is, what I'm here to do. But in fact, the being able to be part of this committee with teachers and guidance counselors and students, all of these people saying these books are important, we need to keep them. That was, I think, much more powerful than my voice would ever have been on its own. And so that was a very important lesson. Um, I think a second thing that I learned is that it takes a lot of time, and thank goodness that the people on this committee were willing to spend 16 weeks, and perhaps there were others who just couldn't. And then finally at the end of it, all of the books were back in the library, but it was 3 months of our lives. So and in other experiences that I've had like this, it takes time for these kinds of things to be addressed. And so I think that was also important. I think not. vilifying the people on the other side and thinking about what actually we do have in common and trying to kind of think about that in my responses and in my attitude towards the experience was important. And I still think about the fact that these were other human beings, other parents who had children, and that's kind of where they were coming from. We just happened to differ on certain uh, values following from that. And yeah, I think those are the major takeaways that I'm thinking about. Yeah.
That's so great. So now when I'm throwing in a question I didn't tell you about before, but now
Okay.
that you teach methods classes and you do this kind of work, what lessons do you carry from that into what you're doing in your methods classes? Like what do you tell your students about this? These about to be teachers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're reminding me of something that I I wanted to say in the last question, and I've sort of like lost my track of it, but I think this is one of the most important things too. It's that we can't teach in fear, and we can't not do the right thing because we think that there might be negative consequences. And that's hard for me. I'm a people pleaser. I'm a, you know, I have a family and I worry about things. And so sometimes I hesitate about stuff like that. But I knew that I had to be on this committee and I knew that I had to say something because if not, you know, what might happen. And I see now in similar situations where there's legislation that's kind of vaguely threatening, I see people self-censoring, and I know that my students, will have the same worries, and they might be tempted to not teach a book that isn't even on the list, just because it might be controversial. And I feel at this point like one of the things we can do is say, well, if they haven't told us not to do it yet, then we can still do it. I think another strategy that I teach, and we've been talking about this, my colleagues and I, just in the last 24 hours, is offering a set of choices for students. And if there are choices and students then opt to read a book that's controversial, well, then that student has chosen and other students don't have to. And so it's the teacher is not, as sort of directly responsible there. That's a strategy that I heard from local teachers in my state who are facing the same troubles, and they still wanted to make sure that students had options for what to read. And so that was kind of their solution. And I've picked up on that and passed it on to my methods course students.
That's great. And the other thing I keep hearing throughout everything you said is about allies, right?
Yes,
Finding allies, developing allies. So you're not doing this alone, And I love the
totally.
line about we can't teach in fear, right? And one of the ways
Hmm.
to not teach in as much fear is to find other people who can help support us as
Yes.
well.
Hmm.
Hey, Mike, thank you so much for participating in this today. I know that your words are going to uh, resonate with people all over who are facing these same kinds of issues. So thanks for
Thank you, Kathy. Really appreciate it.